Hi. Hi, everybody. This is James Lamb, and I'm blogging at snoopyjenkins.wordpress.com, and this is Knocking Heads, number 4. The title of this one is going to be Miles Morales and the House of Diversity. In essence, I'm here to talk about comics with you for a good little while, and I have my main man, Will West, blogging at williambrucewest.com. He's forgotten more about pop culture than you ever know, and so Will, say hello to the people.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I just screwed up your tagline one more time, didn't I?
No, no, you said it right.
I said it
Th-
right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. All right. Look, we're going to get right into it because we have a lot of stuff to cover in a very small amount of time. And I apologize to anyone looking for this conversation beforehand. Technical difficulties are not fun. They end right now. We're starting. So, to encapsulate everything, after the moderate success of Miles Morales as Ultimate Spider-Man, written by Brian Michael Bendis, Marvel created a new teenage superhero, Ms. Marvel Kamala Khan, Pakistani American, I believe, written by G. Willow Wilson, I believe. So this past week, Marvel announced their new female Thor and the ascension of Sam Wilson, aka the Falcon, as the new Captain America. So for mainstream observers, Marvel Entertainment completely embraced racial diversity in superhero comic storytelling. They unveiled the information about female Thor on the somewhat popular daytime talk show The View, and it unveiled information on Sam Wilson's new gig on the Colbert Report. But almost nobody who follows comics and the comic industry seriously applauds these recent announcements. So first question, Will, what accounts for this perception gap? Has Marvel cynically exploited progressive cosmopolitan tolerance, or is their sincere interest in promoting superhero narratives from diverse groups admirable?
I think there's sincere interest, but they don't know how to go about it. They seem to think that to give a minority character, this is someone else's phrase, but a rented cowl is the way to go because it gives them more of a spotlight. But every black man is not trying to be a white man. Every woman is not trying to be a man. So it would mean more if they gave Falcon his own platform to be Falcon. It doesn't change anything, especially from what I've seen with the pictures. He keeps the wings even though he becomes Captain America. You can't do that. You choose one. You either get the shield or you get the wings. You don't become flying Captain America. So, I mean, just that right there shows they aren't quite sure how to go about this. And they think they're doing something bold and progressive, hence the media circus they've been on, but this just isn't the right way. They could have written stronger Falcon stories. They could have introduced. They just got Angela from the Image universe. She could have been a female Thor without calling her Thor, without like hijacking some mythology. She's almost a blank slate as far as her Marvel stuff is concerned. They could have built her into something instead of using the Thor moniker to apply to some other character. It just, I think somebody's heart is probably in the white liberal right place, but I don't think they executed it properly.
See, that's what becomes really difficult for me. Like, I've been a long-standing opponent of race-bending traditional white superhero comic characters. I mean, I've written lots of stuff on that on my site, and all of it has really hammered home this idea that we have a Steve Rogers Captain America, we have a Thor, we have Bruce Wayne as Batman, and it's not like you can't tell interesting stories with these people, but the way to tell an interesting story with those characters doesn't have to involve including a person of color in their role, as if the only, as you were saying, the only way to validate a minority experience is to tell it almost through the narrative lens of white people. Now, I don't necessarily believe, and actually have argued, that it's possible to tell the story of a black superhero effectively because the superhero concept itself is intrinsically about whiteness. Um, and I wrote a piece, Superman is a white boy, that argues this point, that the very concept of the superhero, why they wear the tights, why they have sort of extra normal human abilities, the why they decide to go fight crime or fight super villains or fight each other or fight generally, is all about certain elements of a Western conception of just war that is inherently about a white Western tradition. So, in my opinion, Sam Wilson's already a white character. In my opinion, like people like him are already about telling white stories. So the idea of including them as the white character almost becomes too much. It becomes this quest for pure whiteness where we're basically using estrogen and melanin as diversity veneers for positive public relations later on. That's the reason why I want to sort of deal directly with some of the Miles Morales stuff. Um, but before we get to that, upon hearing about Marvel's recent diversity initiatives, I personally derided the female Thor and Black Captain America as a superhero comics equivalent of racial justice on the cheap. And I repurposed Stephen L. Carter, the Yale law professor, his blistering attack on defending affirmative action policies as compensation for past economic exploitation and injustice. So I want to ask you directly, Will, is that attack, calling this racial justice on the cheap, or the comics equivalents thereof, accurate and fair, or am I just being an asshole? I mean, and if it is fair, does this new Marvel news prove, kind of unequivocally, that the people who generally support race-bending, historically white superhero characters are fundamentally flawed in their thinking? And you know where this is going. You allowed some of your pieces to be used by Keith Child and Nerds of Color. I used to work with them as well. Keith has argued rather forcefully that there's nothing wrong and it's something we should encourage, race-bending these characters to be used. In fact, he argues it in particular when he says that, say, Iron Fist should be a Chinese American as opposed to white American Danny Rand. Or more recently, Albert Chu, the former Jeopardy winner turned columnist for the Daily Beast, has argued in a piece on the Daily Beast that was used in the Nerds of Color site that we should see the Hulk as an Asian American. And these are people who seem to want the validation of seeing one of their number as a white superhero. But it seems pretty tawdry when they're doing it now in Marvel the whole time. So what's your opinion on this?
That's a good, complex question. I think it definitely is on the cheap, but I think people are ignoring another side of this as well, in terms of a lot of people could say that maybe this is an okay practice, but by doing this, it lessens Steve Rogers. Now, some people could say that, well, a white man has enough clout that he could stand to lose something, but they've shown that the Captain America mantle is easily transferable. I mean, it was only a few years ago that it went to the Winter Soldier, then it went back to Steve, now it's gone to Sam Wilson, it'll eventually go back to Steve. That's having a detrimental effect on Steve, and people aren't really focusing on that. I mean, so maybe you could say that Marvel is weakening its base in a way for this racism on the cheap, but I'm not sure anybody notices that. I'm not sure anybody went into this thinking, well, Steve could stand to lose some clout for us to build up Falcon. I think they feel like Steve will be unaffected if we try to build up Falcon, and that's not necessarily the case. As much as I don't really like the character, and I know that you have a similar feeling, I feel like Kamala Khan was the way to go because they created this new character. They still kind of put a former hero's mantle on her, but it was kind of one that wasn't doing anything to begin with. Like, Miss Marvel has her fans, and yeah, I apologize to you, and she's Captain Marvel now, so she got that promotion you guys felt she deserved. But
she's distinguished.
yeah, but I mean, Ms. Marvel was like a third-tier book that needed something injected into it. you don't go to like the big three and do that. They've essentially changed the big three of the Avengers all at once. We have female Thor, we have Black Captain America, and we have new Tony Stark who's driven by his ego. Like who gets the new silver suit and moves to San Francisco. So, I mean, it feels very 90s. It feels like we've got Energy Suit Superman, we've got Azrael Batman, and we've got Hook Hand Aquaman, because they didn't really do anything. Or we've got the Artemis Wonder Woman, if we're going with the big three. And that didn't last. And I don't think anything was really gained from that either. It just it was a stall tactic until they either thought of better stories or realized that, hey, we need to change things up to get our readers back. And it's the same kind of thing with Marvel. I think somebody there feels they're doing the right thing, but I don't think they understand how to go about it. And part of that is because you've got a bunch of white men deciding what diversity is. You don't have these writers of color in a position. Black Captain America is being written by Rick Remender. It's not being written by like Reginald Hudlin, or not that we necessarily want it to be.
Well, we definitely would not want Reginald Hudlin, but David Walker could do it. But,
Right.
It's possible to see a story from David Walker, author of Super Justice Force. Buy it on Amazon now. But you can see that there are many black comic writers out there, just to your point, that could take on that role effectively.
Right. So it just comes down to how much of a bone is the white man going to throw us? And it feels like he's like, hey, here's Captain America. But we don't want Captain America. Nobody asked for Captain America, but it's like, here you go, be happy. We gave you diversity. And you don't really need that. Especially, this kind of storytelling could only really succeed in something like an alternate reality or an alternate timeline, because we know how much licensing drives comics, and that Steve Rogers is on lunchboxes. Falcon's not going to be Captain America long enough to be on a lunchbox, unless somebody custom makes one and puts it on Etsy. That's basically what we're looking at here. Everybody knows who these characters are. Avengers 2 is next summer. If they're smart, they will have these books back to normal the same way Peter Parker was back miraculously in time for Amazing Spider-Man 2. That's just how this stuff works. So, it's throwing us a bone, and it's one we don't necessarily want, and we know that it's not a good bone.
So on that particular point, and I think we covered it to some degree, but I want to directly get your opinion on this, because I'm using proper nouns here, as you can tell. There are many nerds of color, blurs, I read Black Girl Nerds, for example. You'll see Geek Soul Brother, jump into a little bit some of the time. You'll definitely see this from the Nerds of Color website, and a lot of those people of color who are reading comics, who have the entire time they've been reading comics essentially wanted to see themselves. And we have a very public example now of Marvel Entertainment, run in essence, generally speaking, by white men, basically borrowing our melanin, borrowing gender issues, not understanding what to do with them, and not caring to. That's the worst part of this. It's not like you're going to see female Thor deal with feminism issues. She's not going to talk about being a radical feminist in the pages of that comic. They're still trying to sell this to a mostly white male, and oftentimes mostly white and Asian male suburban audience. These are not the kind of people who really want to read the heirs to Audre Lorde talk about Killing Rage. Mixing up my metaphors just a little bit, Killing Rage is obviously the book from Bell Hooks. But still, you can kind of see my point. We're not going to see, Sam Wilson as Cap delve deeply into what it's like to be a African-American symbol of America. It's not as if Sam Wilson, in his 45-year history in Marvel Comics, has ever been a spokesperson for a critique of the American experiment in the way that I would expect an authentic black superhero, if one could be devised, to accomplish in the narrative structure of the of the piece. So for me, this is all just Marvel trying to borrow melanin and borrow estrogen for public, PR purposes, knowing that they're not going to stay Thor and Cap, knowing that this is really only positive PR before the next Avengers movie. Doesn't this give evidence to the idea that wanting to see your race as a white superhero is a bad idea?
Well, I feel like you said that we won't see Captain America Falcon as trying to deal with the racial aspect. I almost fear that we will. I feel that like Marvel writers have balls big enough to try to explain what the black experience is in America, even though they haven't really. I think they would do it because if you go back to a book that I really couldn't stand to read was Uncanny Avengers, same writer Rick Remender tried to talk about there was the controversy over the M word because he didn't want to be called a mutant anymore. To
Havoc
him,
did.
yeah, Havoc didn't. He thought that like that word wasn't something he wanted to be identified by, and it was this whole kind of like it was almost a racial conversation then, and people kind of jumped on it as far as like who are you to have this conversation, what does this exactly mean, and I feel like he would do it again. I feel like that's why, in order to safely navigate these waters, we need what's been called upon before, and it seems kind of tokeny, but in this industry it needs to happen. Marvel and DC need diversity committees. They need people on there who would just say like, nah man, that's not cool. Or like, you might want to lay back on that. But it doesn't seem like they have that. I mean, they still bring in their writers like G. Willow Wilson and Gail Simone and Gail
G.
Simone
Willow Wilson.
and G. Willow Wilson.
I mean, like, there's like two.
Pretty much.
But please finish your point.
Pretty much. So, I mean, they need committees to actually. That way, when they do something like this, you could at least say, like, well, maybe the black guy on the committee did this. But, like, at this point, we know that's not happening. And it just comes down to we are left with the white man's interpretation of diversity. And that is only going to go so far.
So, all right. Not to put too fine a point on this, but I kind of feel like I've been arguing that, like, on my site, writing about comics for quite some time, and it's a little bit like chilling to realize. I'm not trying to say I was right. I mean, it's not that, and it's a kind of a salient point that you're making. What I feel like is happening here is, if it's possible as a minority person interested in comics to look at Marvel's use and or misuse, I would suggest misuse of a diversity initiative here, all trying to get the credit for it without doing any heavy lifting or hard work. I'm just kind of wondering at what point we start to admit that either the comics as they're conceived of right now are too simple or too disinterested in minority issues, identity politics issues, gender issues, to effectively deliver those narratives within their pages, or the industry itself is simply still the purview and the playground of white males for white male power fantasies, with a little bit of like Asian American support sprinkled in, like yes, confetti. But I'm sorry, it's true. When I read Arthur Chu, when I read Keith Chow, I'm reading people who are saying, please include me. I want to be with you. I want to like have the powers and like have like gamma radiation through my veins just like you are. Why can't I be the hero? And it's just tawdry and sad. You can't be the hero because you're yellow. I mean, have you not? Has no one ever told you this? I mean, I don't get the luxury as a black man of being able to ignore the fact that there are always people in my society who are citizens of this country just like me, who see me as the interloper, the problem, the solvable concern. We could just get them away from us. And it feels like in the comics realm, when I'm reading someone like Remender on Uncanny Avengers, I remember all that stuff. And I remember that it was happening at around the same time as Bendis was writing in the X-Men, this whole diatribe between Cyclops and Dazzler, who was then working with or for S.H.I.E.L.D., I don't quite recall. But they had this whole conversation where Cyclops calls Dazzler the Uncle Tom of the mutants. That's the phrase used. Look it up, people. Uncle Tom of the mutants. And I'm like, wait a minute. So the redheaded white guy is called the blonde-haired, blue-eyed white girl in Uncle Tom, and then she counters calling him the Sirhan of the mutants, because that makes it better, and we're all supposed to love the same Bendis for writing Miles Morales. I mean, with all due respect to Bendis and David Walker, I have a real problem with all of that. It just seems like the kind of not to be done, not helpful kind of assumption of diversity. We can actually include this is all our shared history, when really no one has a bloody clue how to talk about any of these issues because of something like you identified, the fact that there are no diversity committees and they kind of need them. I wish Bendis had gone to David Walker and said, hey, I want to have Cyclops call Dazzler the Uncle Tom of the mutants. Is that okay?
But even if he had, though, that's just one guy. You know, it might be okay to him, but also, though, look at it this way. Think of how many people ran to Wikipedia to look up Sirhan and Uncle Tom. So in a way, they're educating that way. I almost feel like comics need to stay away from, like, I just think they need to fight bad guys and aliens and let it be black and white. When it gets real world politicky, that's when things get messy, because you already have to suspend your disbelief on what's going on, and then you got to suspend your disbelief in racial politics as well. It just gets a little jumbled. I think, like you said, they are white man power fantasies. I think there's room for us, though. I mean, I've never been the person to want to see myself in comics, and I've written about this, that it wasn't until Miles came along and I was like, hey, that's kind of cool, I can see myself in comics. And there can be strong characters written, they just can't be treated like second class citizens, and even or tokens. Like with the New 52, Cyborg automatically gets this promotion to the Justice League. But what have they really done with Cyborg to really justify him being in the Justice League? It's just that, oh, well, he's been around this long and it's time for him to get a push. Why? Why was it time for him to get a push? What about Mr. Terrific? And then we already, Mr. Terrific, they just really did some stuff with him. So,
oh, Lord Jesus. That boy never met a white girl he didn't like.
Pretty much. I wrote about that, where, like, in the first issue, he's telling Power Girl, or she's not Power Girl yet, but about his dead wife after he banged her. He's getting out of bed, putting his pants back on. He's like, so let me tell you about my dead wife.
Oh, we're having fun today. Okay, so I'm glad you brought that up, because I did have a question directly on DC's interaction with all of this, and it would be a good time to sort of bring that up now. Why does DC Comics always get the short end of the stick when it comes to diversity in public? In public in particular. Like, they always seem to gain derision for what we'll call cow rental diversity. And you brought this up before, Jennifer Fang at reappropriate.co, calling what has happened when you basically race bend a minority character into this into a traditionally white superhero as essentially, cow rental, because we know what's going to happen to these guys, as we've already discussed. But it seems like Marvel seems to win the internet. Marvel seems to get all this wonderful free press, and everyone loves Marvel, and Marvel looks progressive. It's the veneer of progressive tolerance, cosmopolitan tolerance. While DC fail as a hashtag has been created to lampoon pretty much every time DC tries a diversity initiative and falls on their collective faces. So what is with the distinguished competition? Why is it they grope in the dark for gender and race diversity and always seem to miss the mark, while Marvel seems to do no wrong.
I think it's generational. I mean, when you look at it, DC comes from the golden age, and then Marvel comes from the swinging 60s. And it just comes down to Marvel has always been able to stay hip and cool. And while DC is like your grandfather's comics, your grandpa read Batman, and DC realizes, oh, his grandpa read Batman. Well, they'll one day be somebody's grandpa, and they'll want to say they read Batman, and then just nothing changes with them. It's harder. It's hard to be progressive and forward looking when you spend so much time looking back.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the thing with DC. I mean, every 10 years, they want to act like, oh, we're revamping our universe with a crisis, but every crisis is based on the crisis that came before, and they all tie back to the original crisis. So it's a company that's constantly looking back. Marvel is just on a shifting scale. They've never had a crisis. They've never had a mass reboot. Like, origins change. Uh-oh.
Wait a minute. Can we really say that? I mean, they never had a mass reboot. They never had a reboot of every single property at the same time.
Right.
But
You're thinking of like Heroes Reborn and stuff.
yeah, and to say that House of M wasn't a reboot, I mean, House of M was a pretty, like, the X-Men reboot to think of. I mean, like, a lot of the stories have come out of that particular one. So,
But House of M didn't retcon anything. Same with Heroes Reborn. Nothing was retconned. It rebooted series, but it never rebooted the universe. The
yeah, that's fair.
616 universe has continued to stay steady, which is part of why House of M doesn't take place in 616. They can get away with saying, like, oh, well, this is a pocket universe. Or not House of M, Heroes Reborn.
Okay, right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
I was about to say, because I mean, I've been reading a little bit of Uncanny Avengers, and so much of Rogue and like the Scarlet Witch, which is kind of hilarious, because you would think that remembering that you were in another alternate whatever. This is the problem you have with comics sometimes, where it's just stuff that just stops making sense. Okay, so one more question on like some of the Cal Rental stuff. Just before we move on, the exact same deal. Like Firestorm, B-level character. People know him. He's not all that,
B-level
popular.
character.
Okay, but I feel like
generous.
after Identity Crisis, there were characters like Firestorm that got this like new lease on life, and then you had Justice League Unlimited and a bunch of things. So that if you were, say, a teenager in the late 90s through the 2000s, you're a millennial, you might have gotten some exposure to the Ronnie Raymond Firestorm. And then they make Ronnie Raymond Firestorm Jason Rush Firestorm. It's an obvious sort of race bend. We're going to make this new character who's going to be the Firestorm. He's going to have the Firestorm Matrix and have the life. We're going to build this whole solo book around him. And again, it's a book that I always come to because by issue 6, it was doing overtly racist, overtly bigoted kind of artwork in order to sell books. Firestorm in the chicken suit, I will never let go, ever. Look at his face. It's a never let go face, okay? But my point here is, when DC makes those kinds of mistakes, they get derision. When you see like artwork of Harley Quinn and all kind of weird S&M, like, violent towards women kind of stuff. When you see, hell, Women in Refrigerators is about the origin of Kyle Rayner as Green Lantern. So why is it that DC gets all this vitriol when Marvel seems to? I mean, I'm asking the same question again in a way, but like I just feel like in the present day, we all have this idea, as you said, of DC being your granddad's comic book company, and Marvel being the swinging 60s progressives. But Marvel is doing literally the same thing as DC today, 2014, and people seem to like let their shit go. I don't understand that.
I just think they're able to spin it better. Nobody really knows who's at the wheel over at DC. Well, like with Marvel, it's pretty clear that they go out and do this stuff, and it doesn't look like there's a huge Disney influence. And they can kind of be the bad boys of comics because look out, they're coming doing all this crazy stuff. While DC, everything just kind of, I won't say trickles out, but there's I once wrote a thing about a year or so ago where I was saying how DC's social media campaign is just wrong because they didn't know how to promote their stuff. And it made no sense to me that they were so different because, little known fact, the DC social media guy and the Marvel social media guy were roommates at the time. So somebody sent the article to the Marvel guy, Agent M, and he wrote back. He was like, this is interesting. But it's one of those interestings where you don't really know what that means. But
Yeah.
it comes down to DC being your grandfather's comics. They just don't know how to use modern society to their advantage. They still seem to have your grandfather's opinions on women. You know, your grandfather's take on minorities. Like, you have all these minorities, you have black heroes, gay heroes, all in this, like, position of power, but it's on another Earth. You know, like, it's
Yeah.
okay because it's another Earth. And I mean, that argument could be made for Ultimate Spider-Man, but like Marvel is at least trying to do it for 616. Whether or not that's going to succeed, it won't. But, well, it'll get the spike they want because it's not meant to be permanent anyway. While DC, they just don't get it. They just haven't figured out how to be the cool people. And I don't know if they ever really can. Because part of it is like they're always looked to as like Warner Brothers comics. And they need a win. Like, I think that comes, they've been losing for so long. That's why something like DC Fail can persist. I mean, with the exception of Arrow, like, their movies don't work. Their comics.
Whoa, whoa! Are we really gonna do
Okay.
this? We're really gonna say their movies don't work? We're really
Okay.
gonna act like
I'll,
the Batman Begins, The Dark Knight, and The Dark Knight Rises don't work?
okay. At least one of those doesn't work.
Oh, come on! People say so much about how Rises is terrible. What? What's worse about the whole Rises being, and I know it's Rises you're talking about, and I know this is like somewhat off topic, but damn it, we're gonna do this now. Explain something to me. Why is it that after Rises dropped, whatever people felt about Rises, suddenly you found other big blockbuster movies whose marketing was a direct ripoff of Rises, whose storylines were direct ripoff of Rises? It's all, this is how the hero falls in this really, like, 3-act play sort of way that happened, guess what, in Rises. Iron Man 3 did it. Star Trek Into Darkness did it. They were all, I mean, even how they show in the posters, the city. Star Trek Into Darkness is literally like we're going to take Federation world in destruction and make it into the symbol of a communicator, and that's direct take from the destruction shown of Gotham City on the poster for Rises. Come on.
Okay, here's what I meant. Yes, the Batman things are successful, but the problem with DC movies, and even you have to admit this, they're not fun. Like, at the end of the day, comics are supposed to be fun. They're funny books. You know, sometimes they may have superheroes in them. Don't sigh. They're funny books. They're white power fantasy funny books. And Marvel movies, I know you hate them, but they're fun. DC movies are not fun. They're cerebral, and nobody goes to comics for that.
I do. Like, why do you think I own Watchmen? Why do you think I've read like From Hell every page like 4 times? Like there are some of us who actually want and need the cerebral comic. Case in point, one of the reasons I have such a hard time with superhero comics and diversity is that I just generally believe that it's much harder to tell an authentic, realistic, make me believe the character is actually black story about simple shit. I mean, you know what? We're going to lead directly to our next question because it's a great way to sort of. This is the reason I wanted to talk to you about all this. So I
Wait,
had the
wait, wait.
chance.
Before you get there, don't lose your train of thought. But I do want to add one more thing about the rented cow,
Oh,
where
go ahead. Go ahead.
I don't want to steal too much thunder because I really hope she's like writing something about this. But pointing out that with Falcon being a rented cow situation, this can't end well. It can't end well. There's like history shows us that there are very few positive resolutions to a rented cow once the true owner comes back. Because why is the stand-in all of a sudden losing? It's never a situation of like, oh, I kept this warm for you. Like somebody's gonna die. The all-new Adam died. Like the only thing I can think of recently, there are more examples. That's the one that just jumps to my head. But the only thing I can think of recently where that didn't happen was after Bruce Wayne came back and Dick pretty much just transitioned the cowl right back to him, and there wasn't too much friction there. But other than that, the stand-in typically dies. When Stephanie Brown was Robin for that week, and she got tortured, like it just
Azrael after Nightfall.
right.
He eventually had no idea what to do with him for like 50 issues. Thanks, Danny O'Neill. And then they just killed him all, and you've never been heard from again.
It never ends well. So the thing that scares me is everybody's thinking about now, like, oh, Falcon's Captain America. They're not thinking about what's going to happen to Falcon when Steve comes back, because Steve is coming back, and they already killed, spoiler alert, Sharon Carter. So at this point, Steve only has one ally left. If you really want to show like a hero unleashed or hitting bottom with nowhere to turn, you close him off and take away all his allies. And I just don't think this ends well for Sam.
No, that's a really good point, and it's one that like Jen Fang again from Reappropriate.co brought up with me when she was talking about it. How this is, you have to expect a long hard fall, for these guys who do the rented cow thing. So bridging off of our discussion about cerebral comics and the possible need, my contention that you need a more cerebral comic to get diversity right. Miles Morales. So I had a chance to read all the back issues of Miles. I've read his current stuff, and I have to say I understand now why he is such a beloved character. I totally get it. Miles Morales as Ultimate Spider-Man is a completely... You're not able to dislike him. He's genuinely good. Not like I'm trying to do it, but I'm really questioning my good nature. He doesn't come out of any kind of guile or deceit. He's just a genuinely good kid trying to do his best to live up to an ideal that he doesn't think he can meet all the time. And you gotta love that kind of like stick-to-itiveness to keep on trying, even though he has no training, nothing to prepare him for this. He has to hide it from his parents. He's basically a black Spider-Man. However, Brian Michael Bendis took Peter Parker, killed him, made room for Miles Morales, a black Spider-Man. And that black Spider-Man is 13 fucking years old. No one told me that Miles Morales was that young.
He's only that young in the beginning. There's a time jump.
Yeah, there's a time jump. 22 issues later. 22 issues later, there's a time jump of a year.
Yeah. Although he does look like he's like 16.
No, later he does, and we grow up kind of tall. I actually didn't mind how he looked as much. When he was 13, he looked 13, and when he was a little older, he stretched out. But he's still, seriously, I have hair in places that are older than this kid, and that's not fine for me. Maybe I'm dating myself. You can see the gray, but that's okay. Here's a substantive question. Miles Morales stretches himself into web tights at 13. His run of Ultimate Spider-Man involves C-list supervillains, irrational black paternal anger, criminal familiar role models, the brashness of youth. Again, he was often portrayed as having too little life experience by virtue of his youth, age 13, to recognize why he should be afraid of what he's doing. And then later, parental abandonment, all while forcing himself to live up to the mantle of a sainted white superhero. So did Morales gain and maintain consumer support because he was too young to consider race seriously, and therefore we didn't have to deal with it? Are fans of Miles Morales ultimately the people who want to see themselves reflected in superhero comic art without all the reality BS they're trying to escape by going to the funny book? I mean, I'm obviously paraphrasing my own question here, but you see my point. Does not, and the larger question outside of that, isn't G. Willow Wilson's writing of Kamala Khan in this Marvel now basically writing a ultimately apolitical Jersey City second-generation Pakistani immigrant narrative, similarly about whitewashing the racial identity politics to make these comics more palatable to a still mostly white male audience?
So many words. um,
Well,
I
here's my simplified version.
yes, please.
Okay, the simplified version. Is it easier to like Miles Morales' Ultimate Spider-Man because he's a child, or is it easier to stomach the Black Spider-Man because his cherubic, childlike, youthful nature gives the reader license to ignore race?
I think it's because he's. I think it's probably due to his age, because it's almost like you're discovering the powers along with him, and there's something sort of not refreshing but invigorating about that. Um, yeah, he doesn't really focus on race. That hasn't been a big thing, but he also didn't really focus on puberty either, which I felt probably should have been a big, like, he's already going through all these changes and then he gets bitten by this spider. Like, they didn't do enough of that in my mind. As far as the race stuff goes, I felt they kept enough to make it identifiable, and I was kind of impressed with Bendis at times, like his shady uncle. Everybody's got that shady uncle. Like,
we really do.
yeah.
White people, if you're listening, we all really do have a shady uncle.
Yes, yes.
Sorry, it's true.
Sometimes he's really related, sometimes he's not, but he's still your shady uncle, you know? And like when his dad leaves, I thought that was kind of messed up, because I was like, well, I guess he's now a black kid with a dad who walked out on.
Welcome to the all Negro club. But that's kind of how it felt like reading it. Like, I kind of downloaded it all like one after another, but it kind of felt like reading it that here is the perfect way to deliver a minority superhero. Make him so young that you have to basically hate kids to hate him. And
right.
For those of us who don't have a problem with that, it starts becoming a little bit like difficult because you're reading this character and he's heralded to you from all your friends. It's like, this is the Black Spider-Man. It's something you can relate to. And I couldn't relate to any of his stuff. It's actually worse. This whole Peter Parker template is much worse for me when it comes to Kamala Khan. Because Kamala Khan is, again, she's a little bit of an older teenager, so she's more or less where Peter Parker's age was in the Ultimate Universe when he started. But she's also this kid who is so utterly interested in just being friends in that really childlike, like, please just love me sort of way, that you kind of get mad at her. The first issue, there's a scene in this local deli where one of her friends works, and they come in and they get stuff before school and they leave. And in that scene, they introduce basically like a gender-bent Flash Thompson antagonist for Kamala. And she's described as a concern troll. And in case you didn't know what concern trolling means, the rest of the scene explains concern trolling to you, because you're not used to online conversation. It explains it all to you as it's happening. The point is that Kamala is the least sophisticated of anyone she knows. Even her totally trying to be fundamentalist older brother seems to have more of a American sophistication about himself than she does. And it's done, I think, for useful political effect. You don't want to be caught up in Kamala's family's politics in order to make her likable to people who aren't them. And I feel like there's again, this is like definable narrative methods by which writers creating a race-bent superhero property, a cow rental character, can give you the diversity without ever doing anything meaningful with it, or really like trying at all to explain why the diversity might even be important to the character themselves. That is a extremely difficult problem, and I've never seen this kind of answer to it before. Unlike what DC has done, where a character like Jason Rush is basically just, white. He's basically a damn Oreo. With someone like with Miles Morales, he's definitively black. He's just so damn young that the way that they telegraph blackness in that book involve the shady uncle, deadbeat father, irrational anger towards like minority groups as like some sort of take on like black conservatism. The mom that loves him so much but can't ever save him from any of the terrible stuff. Like small stuff like that. Or even the scene where he gets into the school where him and his friend Ganke can have like all their like, special adventures. Like that entire process is a very like underprivileged minority process, getting into the special charter school via lottery, hoping against hope. It's all a very terrible scene if you've ever seen like, various documentaries on the subject. But we're still left with the same problem of Miles Morales is so young. In order to like him, we're being told basically that blackness by itself is unlikable, but we can make it more palatable to you, like delivering medicine, crushed up penicillin in applesauce to babies. And if we find a way to like neutralize the race by making the character super young or mentally super young in order to get away from the difficulty of race. And I want to hear your opinion on that, because I feel like Miles Morales is a really fun character until you remember he's 13, and that just doesn't really make sense.
Really? I mean, in a world where people are bit by spiders and rich men build suits of armor and gods walk among us, a 13-year-old can't have power. I mean,
no. I'll put it a different way. A 13-year-old can't have power and then have several instances where he deals with adults with power who all ultimately have to let him use his power, though it's probably going to get him killed just like his predecessor. Like, that's the part where it just strikes me as insane. Captain America comes to see Aunt May, Miles, and the girlfriends, Gwen Stacy, and I think MJ might be there too, and basically finds himself getting fussed out by Gwen Stacy, powerless, barely legal jailbait herself, Gwen Stacy, all because Cap has a problem with Miles Morales, a 13-year-old boy, throwing himself in front of supervillains. That's bizarre. That's bizarre on a level that just stopped making sense to me a while ago. And it's in every one of these situations when Nick Fury deals with him, it's like, well, you're 13, that's really young. Okay. I mean, even if you want to say Ultimate Nick Fury generally wants every tool in the arsenal he can get, so he has a certain bias here, it doesn't make sense for a guy like Cap to have to acquiesce to the interests of all these younger, less powerful people just because.
Well, it was my understanding that they were going to train him, and that it was one of those deals of, it felt like they were going in one direction and then editorial threw him in another, where they were all supposed to train him, and you get those issues where, like, okay, he hangs out with Iron Man, and then he hangs out with Cap, and that sort of thing. But then, like, the war happened, and then that all kind of went out the window, and he was forced to grow up prematurely. So, because then you get, like, Ultimates disassembled and the whole deconstruction thing and the American Civil War and just all of that, I think, got in the way, and he grew up faster. It made him grow up a little too quickly. And then you ended up with the Galactus situation and the situation with his mom, and you get to a point where at this point, yes, he's probably just 14, 15, but age is just a number from everything he's gone through in like the past 2 years. Like, I think we can accept, like, maybe not racial stuff, but at least we can accept a level of maturity on par with, or maybe even stronger than Peter Parker when he was Spider Man.
I think that's largely true. But my issue isn't necessarily the fact that he does mature pretty quickly, or the fact that by the time you get the Miles Morales Ultimate Spider-Man comic in stores now, that he's a much more centered character, which I think is going to make for a much better story. I'm actually much more excited about what we're seeing now than what I saw those first 30 or so issues. Um, and also in large measure because those 30 issues from introducing him were pretty much devoid of any major spider villains. Like, he fought no one. And it was kind of, it was weird for me. It was like you have so many people. The Sinister Six is still out there somewhere, and they're just not using them for the time being. I get it. They're getting reserved until later, and you're starting to see a little bit of that now. But for a long time, it was like, here's this really young kid fighting like no one, and we're supposed to be excited because what?
Well, it seemed almost like there was a moratorium out of respect for the death of Peter. Like, it seemed like that was on both sides. Like, the citizens of New York were kind of sad he was gone, and I think the like human part of the villains of New York were kind of sad. Like, they're like, wow, we got our asses kicked by this like 15-year-old kid all these years, and everybody was just kind of shell shocked. And it was a special kind of person who kind of like was opportunist enough to take advantage of that and try to like strike while the iron was hot. And those were like street level criminals because they saw like a vacuum. They saw that there was no longer a Spider-Man or there was no longer a Kingpin. So it changed the focus of, because, I mean, we have to figure Peter fought these kind of people too, but we only got to see him go after the big things. Like Batman, he has Joker and Riddler and all that, but he still will just beat up the guy skimming the ATM machine. So the ATM, because machine's redundant. But you know
No,
what I mean.
I get that. I get that.
So,
Yeah. It's so. I guess final analysis on this one. Would it be safe to say that your position on it is that Miles Morales is likable, and yes, he's likable in part because he's so young, but it's also a way to just get at a much more fun character and still keep the essence of the Spider-Man legacy, narrative story, etc. Do you think that the way that Spider-Man template has been applied to, say, Kamala Khan, suggests that it is a more effective method of giving us a minority superhero? I mean, I'm obviously on the side that it's not really possible to do this stuff effectively at all, and when we see these kind of things, they're still pretty bad. I don't like the Ms. Marvel issues. I really think the writing's terrible. But what I find more difficult about all of this is that we're not really getting the Miles Morales story. We're not really even getting the Kamala Khan story. We're getting the Peter Parker story from the 60s and the 70s done in a new way, rehashed for a new generation, a little bit colored, basically. And that seems to me to be less useful if we're actually interested in viable diversity in comic books. I could obviously be very wrong on this, but after reading these issues, I thought, this character is fun, this character has potential, but this character is not black. This character looks black, but he's not black.
well, then we get into the whole one drop rule because he's not black. You know, like he's black, but he's biracial.
Yeah, he's agnostic on race. I don't even call him biracial, really. I think he's agnostic. The problem with Miles Morales is that race doesn't matter for him, when I think it should for any body who's now being introduced as here's a superhero you should look at. We've gotten rid of the white superhero to show this guy who's different. And
See,
we're going out in public and saying as a company, look how progressive we are for wanting to include a little bit of everybody in our comics, because that's what America is. But it's like we want to include everybody. We don't know how to define everybody because we're all white, but we think, doesn't matter. Let's just tell Peter Parker's story one more time and just put a black guy in Peter Parker's role. It's the same exact story. Like, race does not matter for Miles Morales, for Ganke, for anybody. He's got his little white girl as a girlfriend now, Katie. They have no racial issues. When I was his age and dating white chicks, I had racial issues, okay? like that happened to me. Hi, Sarah. I just want to suggest that maybe it's a bit of a problem when we have these kinds of characters and yet they can't be racially human.
well, I just feel like you always say that it's the Peter Parker story being rehashed, but I think it's a testament to how universal that story was. Because if you go back to like the bare bones of it, let's see. You got a kid who lives in Queens, his parents are dead, he lives with his aunt, he's always late to stuff, he can't keep a job.
Really? He's always late on that CD time.
He's always late to stuff. He can't keep a job. He likes to wear black sometimes. Like, it's one of those things of, if you wrote down characteristics for me, I would feel like, oh, that's a black guy. But nope, surprise, it's a white guy. So, I mean, like, I think the Peter Parker story is just universal, and that's why it can be applied in all these instances with a little flavor added every now and then.
Little flavor, really?
Little flavor.
Just an eye drop, though. You know, too much black spoils the bunch. No, okay. Look, without belaboring this too much, I don't have a problem with the universality of the Peter Parker story, but just every time I have a conversation, like say Facebook or on Twitter or wherever, about diversity in comics, there's always that one random guy who says, well, you know, these are all archetypes. They're all myths. So they're universal stories. So why do we need people to be white, black, or why do we need to see a woman as Thor? Or why do we need to see, like, you know, the Asian American Iron Fist? And I agree on that last, but we do not need to see an Asian American Iron Fist. I'll never let you forget it. But
you just cut a wrestling promo. You're like, I'm coming for you, Sunday.
I just think it's a really. I just think when we get to the point where we're minorities reading comics, like comic media, and we're begging for inclusion, please cast the Asian American Iron Fist. I so want to see myself. I watch it every day. Like, that's really fucking sad, yo. Like, I have a real hard time there. It's not. We can't get at a sort of cultural social justice by skin color diversity alone. They've got to tell our stories. And it's much more effective to tell our stories by having us tell them. I'd much rather see people of color, women, transgendered folk, like, behind the boards, as it were. But even without that, I feel like if you're going to try to take it upon yourself to tell the story of Black Captain America, you gotta understand blackness too, or the black part of it is window dressing.
Right? I mean, because what is Black America, and what is a Black Captain America, and whose America is he captain of, and will all of America respect a Black Captain America?
Right. I mean, I want to see Falcon go down to Mississippi and start telling the Tea Party down there, the reason you all are poor and without anything is because you do not want to find common cause with other poor people who look differently than you. Here, let me show you how. But Rick Remender, whatever his name, he can't write that story. We know damn well he can't write that story because, as you pointed out in Uncanny Avengers, You had Havoc talking about the word mutant like it was a racial epithet, which makes no sense. Like, none. It's not, mutant isn't even close to colored or Negro here, okay? Like, it really isn't. Mutant is what mutants have been calling themselves in Marvel Comics since the 70s. And so suddenly in 2013, Havoc's like, no, 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 no. I'm blonde, I'm blue-eyed, and the N word is evil. What are we supposed to call you then?
Yeah, muties is bad, or gene jokes is bad.
I mean, seriously, it was the dumbest kind of conversation because it was completely devoid of any understanding of what nomenclature means from an identity politics perspective. I mean, if you don't want, if you want to say, for example, like what has happened in the transgender community, where terms like, say, the epithet tranny are not to be used, even though that was a kind of derisive term that you heard more often about that group in '85 or in '90. Like, you hear that. Understanding that not using that term is a show of respect for the people, a show of understanding of the humanity of the people is totally fine, right? But if you're going to make that kind of conversation happen in a comic book, it needs to be based in something that understands what that conversation is. And I feel like the problem with all these diversity initiatives and the people who are writing them is that no one seems to actually care about any of that. I mean, and we're running near on our time, but I want to like sort of jump into a little bit of this kind of a story here. Just jumping up a little bit, is it possible really to actually do this well? Like, if, and by do this well, I mean, is it possible to hit at a meaningful diversity in the pages of, say, a female Thor book? Like, writing a female Thor means exactly what? And more importantly, how has like 70 odd years of Wonder Woman comics given any indication of what to do or what the pitfalls might be of trying to get at a female Thor character?
I don't know. I'm not really a Thor guy, so like part of this is me talking out of class, but it, it just it just reeks of gimmick. Like from what I do know of the character, I don't see what it gains or loses from this. Like I don't see a storyline there. I see a stall tactic. Like this is something to fill up the 6 months until the next event book where Thor will probably return to like Asgard or something. Like it just seems like a stall tactic, kind of like the death of Superman was a stall tactic. You know, it. I don't know. Maybe they'll surprise me, but I don't see what the character loses or gains from this.
Well, another way of looking at it might be this. Do you think it's actually possible for Marvel Comics to produce a feminist comic book? Like, I am convinced they can't. I'm convinced that DC can't. I'm convinced that in the superhero comic world, doing the critical race theory heavy comic book is not possible and probably should not be possible. I'm not willing as you are to suggest that comic books are really just about fun. Um, only because I think that's kind of a limiting perspective in a way. I want comic books to be about whatever comic books want to be about, even in a superhero paradigm. But I do definitely agree that there are some limitations. You want an action comic to have action. You want it to be enjoyable. You want it to be the kind of thing people want to pick up and read. Just like you want to see have a fun experience watching the movies. I mean, getting back to the movie conversation we touched on a little bit earlier, I understand that many fans looked at Man of Steel, looked at the Nolan versus Batman movies, and just weren't having a good time. You know, they just didn't enjoy it. I just feel like there's a limitation in the sense that we're already going to give you action with these films. We're already going to give you like beautiful women and attractive men and muscles and cool gadgets and explosions and dastardly villains and all of that stuff. Why can't it also be possible to tell an interesting dramatic story that deals with some interesting complex issues? Not too much, not too much, but just a nickel bag's worth of adult sense in the middle of all the explosions and boobs and teenage stuff. Like I ultimately enjoyed Man of Steel the way I enjoyed Star Trek Into Darkness, the way I enjoyed The Dark Knight Rises, as all being films that have tried to take the darkness of the human condition and tell a story with that material too. The reason that I dislike the Marvel movies so is that they all have to be extremely simple, as if you can't have fun while your brain is turned on. And it's like the guy who can only go out to the strip club where he can drink quietly and have like titties in his face. Like he can't go to a real club because in a real club he might have to actually talk to women, and that's just too hard. No, no, I want the titties in my face. Like that's not okay, yo. Like on some level, we should be willing as comic fans, especially once we become adults ourselves, to embrace a little bit of adult thinking some of the time. I mean, it's not like there isn't room for it. Lock and Key exists. Like the Wicked and the Divine exists. Nowhere Men exists. You don't have to go into hell. God is Dead from damn it, Hickman. God is Dead from Hickman exists. There are people who are still doing this kind of interesting, more adult-oriented work. Letter 44, the one that you told me about, that comic exists. Why is it somehow improper to see that level of thinking about comics and a comic narrative applied to the movies?
I don't know. You mentioned a lot of things from smaller publishers, though, where do those translate into potential movie viewers? You got to look at the numbers, and Marvel and DC being the big two and the market share that they have, then I guess they kind of get to go free reign with whatever they do. I don't know. I don't really have a great answer for that. It's out there in comic form. I just don't think that's what the mainstream is necessarily looking for. And I think the reason you don't get those discussions on like race and feminism is they probably understand that the issues are out there, but they don't have an answer for it. Just like society doesn't have an answer for it. So it's like, what happens when you bring up the storyline, but then you don't know how to end it? Because you don't really know what the answer is. What is the answer to the racism in Miles Morales' world? Like, how is he to deal with that? How should he deal with that?
I don't know. Ask a black dude. I mean, there are people. I mean, I don't have to tell you, obviously. There are people living these narratives. Like the idea that somehow their experience is too difficult to reflect in the comics they buy is a really hard sell for me.
Yeah, I don't know. That's where you get into the problem with like a diversity community because you could ask a black guy, but then that's just one black guy. Maybe you need like five black guys so you can blend that experience.
Maybe
I
you
don't know.
do. Maybe you do. But maybe they can play it themselves. Because there are people doing that work. But also, if Marvel isn't actually interested in telling the story of and a reasonable, like, authentic story about a black male experience, but they're interested in showing a black male experience that they have constructed, one has to wonder if that's moral. I am obviously on the side that says it's not moral, but what I noticed when I started writing about comics, maybe 10 months ago, was that for many, many, many comic fans, for many nerds of color, they are more interested in being seen than in being seen as human. And that's the part on the audience. I mean, we put a lot of emphasis, and this is probably going to be the last thing, we're running short on time, but like we put a lot of emphasis on what Marvel can do, what DC can do, and I think all that emphasis is really justified. But I'd really like to have your straight up, like, unfiltered opinion on the audience. Is it possible that the progressive comic fans or comic fans generally are simply asking for too little by saying, "I just want to see myself. Please give me an Asian Hulk"? I mean, just what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's more like foot in the door, where it's like it's good to see yourself at first, and then maybe you can add some nuance later on. But at the moment, you don't have anything. You don't see yourself, or you see yourself as like a fleshed out character. So they feel like even if it's just a token or a caricature, at least they're there, and then there's potential for them to maybe grow into more. But that usually doesn't happen. Usually you get this one-dimensional character, and you're stuck with someone like Vibe, you know. So
Oh God, the way they even drew Vibe, the new Vibe, still looked like he stepped off the set of the Warriors. Like I just every time I see Vibe, I keep going like Warriors. It's terrible, and people bought this. Like we're consumers, right? We're talking about a social interest based around transactions. We buy this content, or supposed to buy this content, and that's how we're able to enjoy it. I stopped buying. I freely admit, come after me. I stopped buying. I can't spend money on companies knowing that they're crapping all over me. I would prefer an all-white superhero story that's interesting and complex and maybe even a little dark than a story involving a race-bent, cow-renting superhero that only exists because of a public petition from like 18 Million Rising and Change.org and the Nerds of Color, just to get somebody of color in a suit so that a few people can show their kids and go, hey, look, see, you too can be Miss Marvel. You too can fly through the air in your mind, but, you know, you can be a part of the world too now. Like, you should already know that, damn it. Like, I mean, it's just, if it's not going to be justifiably honest to us, and if we always have to fight for some type of incrementalism when we want to see ourselves, then what exactly is there to stop it the next time Joe Quesada wants to go talk to Stephen Colbert or Whoopi Goldberg on The View about, hey, look what we made, and trying to get some good PR out of our genders or our melanin?
well, you got to think of the children, because they're the ones who everybody likes to think comics are for kids, but they really aren't. But they should be catering to kids so they can actually have an audience that exists 25 years from now. And when you think of introducing your kids to comics, you don't want them dealing with the complexities of race and gender politics. Like if I had a kid right now who's like 8, I don't want him picking up a comic and dealing with all this stuff that I'm trying to like shield him from in the world anyway. But it'd be nice to see someone who looks like him, just even if it's just to trick him into the comic shop, you know, in order to find more books. And I've been reading a lot of comments lately, and that seems to come up a lot, where people are saying that like Halloween rolls around and kids are like, well, where are all the black heroes? It doesn't matter about like the storytelling or whatever. They just want someone, they know that they don't look like Superman, they don't look like Batman. Like, where's the person that looks like them? That's why you have like an industry of black dolls and things like that. So in some cases, it is enough just to have that representation. But I think you could have both. You could have the characters who are there just for the representation, but then you could also have the nuanced characters like later on. There's room for both, but we tend to clamor for the lesser because it's easier.
Well, I'm certain that that's exactly what Rick Remender thinks, but but it is a fair point that if you're trying to shield children from the complexities of the world, if that's your project, then what I suggest makes a good comic probably does not apply. Kamala Khan does. Kamala Khan is a great superhero if you're 11.
Yeah.
It's just not a good superhero if you're 33. And I find myself saying, okay, either my choice is to go to Image or the largest of the small publishers or some other super small publisher in order to find a comic book that I can read without like feeling bad about myself, or I go to the superhero stuff and like my eyes bleed. And I'm kind of wondering why those are my choices. Because when it comes around to the movies, yes, I am a big fan of what DC has done for the most part. There've been some mistakes. No one forgets Green Lantern. That was terrible. But but where they've gotten it right is advanced the idea of what you could do with a superhero narrative. And I haven't seen anything from Marvel that's come close to that. So when you see all these people in love with Marvel movies, it's like, yeah, you know you're going to have a good time, but you're going to have the exact same good time you can have from a Bond film, the exact same good time you can have from, anything with like Lawrence Fishburne like punching someone in the face. I mean, like it doesn't take very much to create an action movie good time. It's so easy to do that. Sylvester Stallone is still making action movie good times that are actually kind of fun. If you ever watch the Expendables director's cut, you should do that. That's a great movie. It's a great action movie. It's actually fun. But I digress. I wanted something that will actually appeal to me as an adult, and my choices are basically give up on the stuff that I grew up with because I know is how terrible it is then and now, or jump into the indie stuff that I will never see on a big screen, that I will never see outside of a very limited and small way, and I'm a little bit depressed about that kind of idea, especially in moments where Sam Wilson as the Falcon is like the new black Captain America. Don't I feel like I've arrived?
Well, I think there's something to be said for like lifespan of fandom in terms of maybe we shouldn't be reading superhero comics anymore. You know, like comics aren't for kids, but I think you come to a point, like I got to a point probably in the last year or two where I feel like I've seen everything. Like, yeah, I still buy some stuff because certain books can still surprise me, like the Miles Morales stuff and Deadpool's fun. But ultimately, when it comes to like the big event stuff, I've seen everything by this point. 20 years will do that to you. And maybe it's just my time is over. So I feel like you do get to an age where you can't look to the big two anymore. It's like you get to that age where you start having to take vitamins and supplements and like Image and the smaller press are the vitamins and supplements of the comic fan.
Oh, yeah, I think you're absolutely right on that. I think that's a really great point to leave it on. Will West, thank you again. You really do know more about pop culture than me. But I think you're absolutely wrong on the damn movie thing. We'll have a discussion later. I'm coming for
I'm waiting. I'm waiting.
you. All right, man. Hey, I want to just again say a real shout out, thank you to Will West for doing this podcast with me. It really was an enlightening discussion, and so hopefully anyone out there listening, thank you for watching as well and listening to us rant and rave over comics and diversity. I hope it was enjoyable, and we'll see you next time. Thanks again.